currently Earth.
On April 6 in the year 1830, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is established. In Fayette, New York, Joseph Smith, the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormon Church, organizes the Church of Christ during a meeting with a small group of believers. Born in Vermont in the year 1805, Smith claimed in 1823 that he had been visited by a Christian angel named Moroni, who spoke to him of an ancient Hebrew text that had been lost for 1,500 years. The holy text related the story of Israelite peoples who had lived in America in ancient times. Over the course of the next 6 years, Smith dictated an English translation of this text to his wife and other scribes, and in 1830, the Book of Mormon was published. In the same year, Smith founded the Church of Christ, later known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Fayette. The religion rapidly gained converts, and Smith set up LDS committees in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois. However, the Christian sect was also heavily criticized for its unorthodox practices, such as polygamy, and on June 27th in 1844, Smith and his brother continued their eternity. Smith and his brother were attacked in a jail cell by an anti-LDS mob in Carthage, Illinois. 2 years later, Smith's successor, Brigham Young, led an exodus of persecuted Latter-day Saints from Nauvoo, Illinois, along the western wagon trails in search of religious and political freedom. In July of 1847, the 148 Initial Lds Pioneers reached Utah's Valley of the Great Salt Lake. Upon viewing the valley, Young declared, quote, "This is the place," unquote, and the pioneers began preparations for the tens of thousands of LDS migrants who would follow them and settle there. It was April 6 in the year 1896 that the Olympic Games, a long-lost tradition of ancient Greece, are reborn in Athens, 1,500 years after being banned by the Roman Emperor Theodosius I. At the opening of the Athens Games, King Georgios I of Greece and a crowd of 60,000 spectators welcomed athletes from 13 nations to the international competition. The first recorded Olympic Games were held at Olympia in the Greek city-state of Elis in 776 BC, but it is generally accepted that the Olympics were at least 500 years old at that time. The ancient Olympics, held every 4 years, occurred during a religious festival honoring the Greek god Zeus. In the 8th century BC, contestants came from a dozen or more Greek cities, and by the 5th century BC, from as many as 100 cities from throughout the Greek Empire. Initially, Olympic competition was limited to foot races, but later a number of other events were added, including wrestling, boxing, horse and chariot racing, and military competitions. The Pentathlon, introduced in 708 BC, consisted of a foot race, the long jump, discus, and javelin throws, and wrestling. With the rise of Rome, the Olympics declined, and in 393 AD, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I, a Christian, abolished the games as part of his efforts to suppress paganism in the Roman Empire. With the Renaissance, Europe began a long fascination with ancient Greek culture, and in the 18th and 19th centuries, some nations staged informal sporting and folkloric festivals bearing the name Olympic Games. However, it was not until 1892 that a young French baron, Pierre de Coubertin, seriously proposed reviving the Olympics as a major international competition that would occur every 4 years. At a conference on international sport in Paris in June of 1894, Coubertin again raised the idea, and the 79 delegates from 9 countries unanimously approved his proposal. The International Olympic Committee, IOC, was formed, and the first games were planned for 1896 in Athens, the capital of Greece. In Athens, 280 participants from 13 nations competed in 43 events covering track and field, swimming, gymnastics, cycling, wrestling, weightlifting, fencing, shooting, and tennis. All the competitors were men, and a few of the entrants were tourists who stumbled upon the games and were allowed to sign up. The track and field events were held at the Pentathlon Stadium, which was originally built in 330 BC and restored for the 1896 Games. Americans won 9 out of 12 of these events. Awesome. The 1896 Olympics also featured the first marathon competition, which followed the 25-mile route run by a Greek soldier who brought news of a victory over the Persians from Marathon to Athens in 490 BC. In 1924, the marathon was standardized at 26 miles and 385 yards. Appropriately, a Greek, Spiridon Lewis, won the first marathon at the 1896 Athens Games. Pierre de Coubertin became the IOC president in 1896 and guided the Olympic Games through its difficult early years when it lacked much popular support and was overshadowed by World's Fairs. In 1924, the first truly successful Olympic Games were held in Paris, involving more than 3,000 athletes, including more than 100 women from 44 nations. The first Winter Olympic Games were also held that year. In 1925, Coubertin retired. The Olympic Games have come to be regarded as the foremost international sports competition. At the 2000 Summer Olympics in Sydney, more than 10,000 athletes from 200 countries competed, including nearly 4,000 women. In 2004, the Summer Olympics returned to Athens with more than 11,000 athletes competing from 202 countries. In a proud moment for Greeks and an exciting one for spectators, the shot put competition was held at the site of the Classical Games in Olympia. April 6 in the year 1917 is when our nation officially entered World War I. It was 2 days after the U.S. Senate voted 82-6 to declare war against Germany. The U.S. House of Representatives endorses the declaration by a vote of 373-50, and our nation formally enters World War I. When the Great War erupted in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson, our nation's 28th president, pledged neutrality for the U.S., a position that the vast majority of Americans favored. Britain, however, was one of America's closest trading partners, and tensions soon arose between the U.S. and Germany over the latter's attempted quarantine of the British Isles. Several U.S. ships traveling to Britain were damaged or sunk by German mines, and in February of 1915, Germany announced unrestricted warfare against all ships, neutral or otherwise, that entered the war zone around Britain. 1 month later, Germany announced that a German cruiser had sunk the William P. Fryer, a private American vessel. President Wilson was outraged, but the German government apologized and called the attack an unfortunate mistake. On May 7th, the British-owned Lusitania ocean liner was torpedoed without warning just off the coast of Ireland. Of the 1,959 passengers, 1,198 continued their eternity, including 128 Americans. The German government maintained that the Lusitania was carrying munitions, but the U.S. demanded reparations and an end to German attacks on unarmed passenger and merchant ships. In August, Germany pledged to see to the safety of passengers before sinking unarmed vessels, but in November sunk an Italian liner without warning, continuing the eternity of 272 people, including 27 Americans. With these attacks, public opinion in the U.S. began to turn irrevocably against Germany. In 1917, Germany, determined to win its war of attrition against the Allies, announced the resumption of unrestricted warfare in war-zone waters. 3 days later, the U.S. broke diplomatic relations with Germany, and just hours after that, the American liner Housatonic was sunk by a German U-boat. On February 22nd, Congress passed a $250 million arms appropriations bill intended to make the U.S. ready for war. In late March, Germany sunk 4 more U.S. merchant ships, and on April 2nd, President Wilson appeared before Congress and called for a declaration of war against Germany. 4 days later, his request was granted. On June 26th, the first 14,000 U.S. infantry troops landed in France to begin training for combat. After 4 years of bloody stalemate along the Western Front, the entrance of America's well-supplied forces into the conflict marked a major turning point in the war and helped the Allies to victory. When the war finally ended on November 11th in 1918, more than 2 million American soldiers had served on the battlefields of Western Europe, and some 50,000 of them had continued their eternity.